So welcome everybody, commissioners, guests, to our Richmond Planning Commission meeting of the 20th of December, almost the solstice by one day, missing the solstice. So anyway, hope everybody's well. Glad to see you all. And we will start our meeting by looking at the agenda and reviewing that so that people can know if they want to make a comment, whether it's on the agenda or not. So basically our agenda is going to consist of two important items, both of which are time sensitive. So I'm really going to try to divide the meeting in about half so that we can get both of these agenda items in. The first one is a review of our public hearing. The second one is a discussion of Buttermilk. It's a request for additional density. So both of these are important. They both have to do with housing, just in case anybody's been listening in on the dialogue lately here in Richmond. So Chris, I'm counting on you to remind me if we get over 8:15 or so that we will need to go to our next topic.
I'll keep an eye on it.
Thank you. That's great. All right. So anybody have any adjustments they want to make to the agenda? Okay, hearing none, we'll proceed with that agenda. Anybody would like to make a public comment on a non-agenda item, anything that's not on the agenda?
Well, just real briefly, and I'm going to restate the obvious. Ain't no such thing as a 100-year flood anymore.
Yes, good point. We have had 3 of them in the last 6 months, so it's calling that designation into question. Yep. All right. Well, at some point, I'm sure that will come into our discussions about various items. Maybe not tonight, but yeah, good point. Okay. So the other thing I'd like to say is that when we talk about the public hearing, it's primarily a discussion session. We did have the public hearing. We took public input. We will take comments from the public, but hopefully not the same comments that were made at the public hearing, and that they will be relatively brief so we can hear from the commissioners. Okay, we'll quickly look at the minutes of our December 6th meeting. Any corrections, additions, comments anybody would like to make about those minutes? Okay, hearing none. We will accept those minutes as written into the record. They were posted, so everyone has had a chance to read them. All right, and we will now at about 7 after 7, we will move to our first agenda item, which is to discuss the information that we received during our public hearing on the 6th of December and refine our amendment proposals that we would like to move along to the select board for their public hearing procedure. This has taken quite a while, this project, and it would be good to move it sooner rather than later. So I'm hoping that we can come to agreement about that. I'll start by just really quickly reviewing the memo that I put together for this discussion. Anyone can make a comment, especially commissioners. I'm interested in hearing from you as we go through it, or you can save your comments till the end. This is just going to be like a brief recap of what it seems like we need to talk about. And so anyway, here goes. So on the first point on the memo was that there were no objections to the residential uses via PUD in the industrial commercial district. We had no comments during the public hearing about that, and as far as I know, we received no comments, no written comments about that, which was the primary purpose of this project. The second point is that the PUD revision section basically received one comment, or one of the items on that received comments, which was the removal of the master development plan language from wherever this language occurs in the subdivision regulations or the zoning regulation. So we agreed, the Planning Commission approved the removal of this language at our October 18th meeting. And we had a couple of comments about it. A couple of guests talked about it. And the points that were brought up are listed here under number 3. And there were, as far as I could tell from doing the minutes, there were 3 points that were made. And I'll list them briefly and then we'll talk about each one. The point A was that misrepresentation of facts was not adequately addressed in the zoning regulations, and that the DRB was perhaps not appreciating misrepresentation or inconsistency. That was the first point. The second point was that there was a lack of transparency in the Planning Commission process, as changes to the subdivision regulations may not have been adequately warned so that people could come and speak about that. The third point was that instead of removing it, and this seemed to be the meat of the argument, instead of removing the master development plan language, we should be strengthening it. The subtext being that neighbors should be able to have a more complete understanding of what the future will bring. So, does anyone have anything they want to say here at this point? All right, so I'll go through my list of how I dealt with these 3 points, and people, raise your hand at any point if you want to make another comment or save them for the end. For number A, the point made, there is, in looking at this, Keith and I've felt that this is not a valid point, that misrepresentation is already prohibited in our zoning ordinance in 2 different places. It's prohibited for applications in section 5.3.3, and it is prohibited in appeals in 8.4.3. This is where 24 VSA 4470A is involved. It's actually cited in section 8.4.3 of our zoning regulations. So to us, we felt that misrepresentation has been adequately addressed in our zoning ordinance and that we don't need to do anything. We have that language already. As far as whether the DRB has appreciated misrepresentations, that is not something that the Planning Commission has any control over. That is a DRB function, and it is to them that point would have to be addressed. So, point B, that...
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Chair. So I just want to, it was the the person who spoke in opposition, was what they were trying to convey, that the Planning Commission should strengthen.
Hi, Shireen, how are you?
Hello?
So,
hey,
Allison. Yeah, you need to be muted, Allison.
Okay, just a minute.
Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
there, sorry.
The question being whether the intent was that we should strengthen language so that the DRB would have a clear signal.
Yes, I'm planning on Friday.
Allison, can you mute, please? Yeah, so we can discuss that under point C, which was that the language of the master development plan should be strengthened rather than removed.
Okay.
So as it stands, the DRB needs to do that job, whether the language is strong or weak. And so we can talk about it when we want to strengthen the language. We can talk about the relationship to the DRB then.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yep. All right. So we come to point B that was made. And this point was made by Bradley Holt, that the proposed changes to the subdivision regulations were not adequately warned. And Keith and I felt that this was a valid consideration. There was no intent to conceal this, and they were mentioned in the bylaw amendment report, but that was the only place. They were not warned in our official notifications or warnings. So we do feel that this needs to be corrected so that we don't have a procedural issue here. So our proposal for what to do is written out in this memo, which is to remove any references to the subdivision regulations from the amendment packet, while continuing to remove the master development plan language from the zoning ordinance. To approve that package for transmittal to the select board with no references to the subdivision regulations. However, immediately following that, to initiate a public hearing process for the subdivision regulations. So it's essentially dividing it into two portions. And the reason that this appeared to be the better option is because we would like to move this along in a timely fashion, for considering the time that it has already taken to process the request to have the residential uses in the IC district. And the next procedure to just deal with the subdivision regulations, to bring them into conformance with the changed zoning regulation, should be a relatively short process, because we have actually already done the work. We have the way the language would look in the subdivision regulations. And so it will be relatively easy to move that project into our public hearing procedure. So that's the preferred option. However, if we wanted to, we could rewarn the entire package and have another public hearing on the rewarned entire package. This seemed to us to be possibly unnecessarily cumbersome. And since we're going to have another hearing anyway, we might as well just do it on the subdivision portion. It will mean the two ordinances are for a short period of time not aligned with each other. But since most PUDs are subdivisions, it should not present a problem if one comes up in the period when they're not completely aligned. And we would move right away to the next phase. And if it takes a long time to get this all to the select board anyway, then maybe they will end up considering the two public hearings at the same time. Mark.
So your suggestion is to remove any language in the PUD section about the master development plan requirements?
Yes, as we had agreed at our October hearing, was to remove the master development plan language from the zoning regulations. And at that time, we didn't specify the language in the subdivision regulations because we hadn't fully taken that, hadn't fully studied the subdivision regulations.
Okay.
So based on that decision that we made to remove it from wherever it needed to be removed, we removed it also from the subdivision regulations. So we're just eliminating that step that we did for the moment.
Yep, no, I follow the timeline and the logic behind it. And certainly, I think when I was thinking about it in October, I wasn't necessarily thinking about the implications of the appearance of the removal of master development plan language from the zoning regulations. And during the hearing, it made me think about the points that were made, that it could give the impression that Richmond isn't interested in their master plan development and interest of a big cohesive understanding. There is still no doubt that the language that's there is toothless. But rather than take it, I guess where I'm going with this is, what if we were to leave it in the proposed language that's related to the PUD? Don't take it out of there. Don't take it out of the development area, and then have a real conversation about how we can improve that. Since it doesn't really have any impact one way or the other at this point, honestly, and any master development plan can be just wingding together and changed on a whim. Leaving it in is the same difference as taking it out, except for the impression it may give that a master development plan isn't important. And I think that the commission would agree that some type of master development plan does have value, but maybe that's what I'd like to put to the commission is, do we think this is important? Or are we just looking to take it out and not revisit it? And leave it, take it out, leave the language alone and leave it by the side of the road and continue on? Or are we going to try and fix that component of the regulations? And if we do that, then we can leave it in, and then it'll still be there when we do actually put some logical language behind it.
Okay, so that basically brings us to point number C on this list of points that were brought up. Point number C is the substantive issue here, whether we want to take this language out or whether we want to leave this language in and do something with. It is possible, only a little more complicated, to approve this for transmittal to the select board. It would likely require another meeting because it's not just a one sentence that would be taken out. It's wherever the master plan language occurs. So we would have to write a different document to submit to the select board if we wanted to do that. So anyway, we get to this point C, which, because we are opening up the PUD section, we have to open it up in order to achieve our aims with the residential uses in the IC district. We have to refer to the PUD section, make a revision there. So this seemed like an opportunity to deal with something that has been problematic for the DRB, for the zoning administrator, for folks who are looking for it to give them some certainty about the future, which it doesn't do. It is ineffective. So this is an opportunity to deal with it. That's kind of the first thing. I personally have not heard any arguments that would suggest that adding more and more language to this is going to be more effective, is going to provide any more certainty. It can be amended at any point in time. So there really is no certainty about open space in the future provided by the language, even expanded language. So what we tried to do instead was to add the critical permit conditions as a portion of the zoning ordinance to at least give people an understanding of what was important or crucial to the approval itself. And also, as we look at the different districts, to add some standards there that are going to help the DRB to understand what is critical about open space and wetlands, forest blocks, all of those different natural resources components. So, but those are things that would not be in the PUD section. They would be in the sections themselves. Those would be standards that the DRB would look to decide whether things were critical or not. So I have not heard an argument that suggests that there is a way to make sure that the land is not, if open space that is left in a PUD or a subdivision is not developed, because both the master plan and the approval itself can be amended and changed unless there's some kind of permanent conservation easement or other legal tool that establishes the in perpetuity part of preserving open space. So, so at some point, yes, we will put it to the Planning Commission as to whether to remove this or to try to add other specifications that I haven't heard any of so far yet, as to what would make this language feasible, workable. Yeah, Mark.
Well, I would just quickly say that, I mean, our ultimate goal in moving this language forward, certainly it was a nice perk that we thought we'd be able to clean up some ineffective language, but ultimately it was to get the commercial district to enable PUD development of a property that already has pre-existing residential activity on it. That's ultimately our sole goal here, and I am concerned that if we drop the language regarding any sort of concept to big picture understanding of development, that it's going to spark a lot of interest in the community and a lot of pushback at our level, and certainly more importantly at the select board level. Whereas if we were to put the language back in and move it forward, then we would be, there wouldn't be contention about it. Because as you mentioned in your first highlight of the memo from the chair, is that everybody's on board with the gist of what we wanted to accomplish, which is, open that up to PUD development for residents. I'm worried that we're going to get some hard pushback against that, and it will stop more than that, and then that'll delay it even further, because if it does get pushed back at the select board level, then the select board is going to be like, okay, we're going to kick this back down to the lower court and have us start all over, because they're not going to be able to rewrite that language. Whereas if we just rewrote it now and moved it up, then it would be a cleaner document. That's the gist of what I was trying to get at.
Great. Any other commissioners want to weigh in on this question?
I guess feels like everyone was waiting for me.
Yes.
I think removing the MDP language ultimately is the correct path forward. I mean, I don't see how, as we discussed, that we've gone over a few times, I don't see it. There's not really any teeth to it. I think it gives a false sense of certainty to neighbors in the town. I think there's a lot of drawbacks to it, and there's not really any benefits to it aside from giving the impression that we would ideally like some master plan. But as has been said, it's kind of toothless. So there's not really there's no recourse there if that's amended or changed. And then I think ultimately we don't want to stop the ability to amend and change any plan if it meets the regulations as we have them written. I think that's a critical point, and that's not on us to determine. That's on the DRB. So I think removing it going forward is the correct path. I do think that there is an argument that we didn't correctly warn it, given that it's being removed from the PUD and the subdivision regulations as we have it written. So I guess since we were ultimately focusing on the PUD regulations initially, I think that removing it from those and cleaning it up as we had properly warned would be prudent. I think that's the right path forward. I think that revisiting that the language in the subdivision regulations is warranted. Strengthening it, I think could be advantageous, but I haven't been able to put together how we would do that legally. There's the critical permit conditions, but ultimately, if we it seems like all those conditions that we could impose, or the DRB could impose, are already in place by having density requirements and dimensional standards and setbacks and et cetera in the district. So we would just be reimposing regulations that are already there with the critical permit language. I guess I just don't see. I guess I don't quite understand the end goal of suggesting that. I mean, I understand that everyone wants to have certainty in their community of what's going to change, how it's going to change, what it's going to look like, and I fully understand that. I go through that myself. My wife and I discuss that with, development happening in our backyard. But at the same time, I don't think it's reasonable to move somewhere and expect to know what every neighbor is going to do. I do think it's reasonable to expect everything they do to be held to the regulations as they're written, and that's why we're having this process. But I think that the regulations cover that. So I guess I'm having a hard time understanding why we would add more language, specifically addressing this, when we can address all of the issues in other parts of the zoning regulations, and then just ensure that they are enforced fairly, accurately, and consistently, which I think that for, obviously some are open for interpretation, but I think overall we do have that situation right now. So I guess synopsis, I think they're both worth revisiting. I don't think the MDP language is, really has any advantage. I think it kind of gives a false sense of security. And so I think we should remove it from the PUD language right now, and then revisit it later while properly warning it for the subdivision regulations. I do think that properly warning it, as Bradley had pointed out last week, is really important, because there are valid concerns there. And if anyone would have shown up to speak to that and didn't feel that it was properly warned, I think that's a pretty large disservice we would be doing to the town.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Anyone else on the commission would like to weigh in? And one just brief comment about the critical permit conditions language. So this has been suggested by our attorney. His case law that he is experiencing and has for the last whatever number of years has to do with amendments that are being brought to master plans and approvals that involve conditions that people feel should be held to a higher standard. So this is why it's in there. This is why that language is in there. And so it's primarily for the follow-up to approving a permit. it's to amending it in some way, and people would like to know what is critical to it, what is important, what has enabled the DRB to make this decision that it's okay to approve this project. So that's why he would like to see that in there, is because he feels it will be helpful in resolving these cases, especially that are brought on appeal.
Yes, I'm just trying to understand. I get the primary constraint we had talked about, and I'm sure there are many other constraints, but the primary one seems to be open space. And it seems like that is governed more by density and lot coverage. And so even in a PUD where, you might allow 1/10 acre lots in a 1 acre zoning with the other 0.9 acres per house being allocated as common space, that wouldn't be amendable later on. I mean, the DRB could look at it and say, yes, you've been granted this. It's above and beyond what's allowed because you went through the PUD process. The total density is the same, but each house has a smaller lot. And that wouldn't be amendable unless something had changed as a constraint. If the zoning had changed, then the zoning's changed, and that's no longer a constraint. So I don't see how the critical permit language would address that one. And since that's the one we had talked about, that's kind of what I had put the most thought into. I'm sure there are other constraints as well, as far as oversized setbacks and stuff. So it seems like having really strong underlying zoning regulations would be more important and all encompassing than having the critical permit language. And I just don't want. I feel like the critical permit language would be more legally binding, but could also provide the false sense that nothing is amendable. There's a few critical things, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that there's no changeability in the PUD process or any process. And I just want to make sure that's very clear. As our town and these approvals they're all changing and evolving things, and so we can make things critical, but we can make those critical without the critical permit language, and they can be held by the dimensional standards. So I'm just trying to understand that a little bit, I guess. So,
Well, the other factors are any kind of natural resources protections. So, and those are, some of them are already involved, like wetlands protection. But this is pointing out, for instance, that, all right, so this portion of this property is in a wetland. That is a critical permit condition because we do not want that to be amended. It is not impossible to amend because you can't make anything totally impossible to change. But it does hold it to a higher standard so that people will understand that this is a wetland. And there may be other natural resources constraints that we are going to have to address when we come to talking about the AR district, which is the statutory requirements to protect forest blocks, for instance, and critical habitat connections.
So would this give us additional protections above and beyond what's statutorily required for wildlife corridors in critical habitats? Would this provide additional protection, or would it just make clear that those protections are outlined?
It would make clear that those are protections. And, the statutory language around Act 174, for instance, which talks about forest block protection, it doesn't say this is the law, you have to protect this. It puts in place a strategy for municipalities to adopt protections for these natural resources. So we're going to have to come into discussion about that, especially when we talk about the AR district. What are the protections that we're going to put in place for these natural resources that the state desires us to protect? It's going to be our regulations. So, and what the critical permit conditions are is just pointing out that in this particular unit, not only do you have density and, those other setbacks and all of those number requirements, but you also have this portion, this area of wetlands that's just, will be defined. And it will be some more work for the DRB. They're going to have to look at the land and say what is suitable. Right now, they just have a vague kind of mandate to protect the land. That's it. So we want to give it more specificity and say that these are things, as opposed to that you want to move a lot line from here to there, which is still legal. You can do that. That's fine. That's not critical. But these other questions involve resources that need to be defended, and we need to put those standards not in the PUD section, but in the sections that to which they are relevant. So I hope that answers it a little bit. There are other things
Yeah.
besides density and setbacks that
Sure, I
may
think
be
that's an important
critical.
building block then. I think we should definitely pursue that language. I mean, I think that we all have the understanding that it's important to protect those things, and we believe that they're being protected, but I think providing language that will clearly outline in every permit application where those resources, however they may be defined and located, are to be protected, I think is important. So yeah, I see the value in that.
Okay, any other commissioners want to weigh in? Allison, Chris?
Yeah, I just have one general comment. I think in view of the recent storms and floods that we've had, that we just have to be mindful of the fact that people, we're talking about the village, right? The people who are
Well,
living.
we're talking about, in the PUD section, we're talking about everywhere. And it's mainly
Okay,
a concern where there's open space, which there isn't much of in the village.
yeah, okay.
So,
Well, I guess I'm feeling particularly cautious about the village because of what's happened recently with the floods, and we thought we'd had a bad one earlier in the summer, and then we just had another one. I think that people do need to be mindful and not be adding buildings in that sort of area. I don't know. I guess I've said for many years that God's owned Richmond. We've got floodplain, steep slopes, and that's about it. So we just have to, whatever we do, it just has to be with the eye, the protection for the value of people's property and their efforts that they put into property, that it not be in a situation where it's easy for that property to get compromised by inclement weather. I think that's just very on my mind these days.
and maybe, flooding is an area where it's important to say, okay, this area floods all the time. It's not in the floodplain. This is an area that floods, and maybe that would be a critical permit condition, was that this is an area that water stands in for which there's no drainage. So, that would be something.
I guess I'm feeling particularly about that, Virginia, because this last summer, for example, when we had so much rain, so many people who live in the community came to my swimming pool, and I heard one story after another of flooded basements and difficulties and whatnot. And especially if you happen to be, I feel really bad for the people that have dirt cellars still, that, bought some of these old houses that still have dirt cellars. This is a real serious problem.
Yeah. So we'll definitely be mindful of that.
Yes,
that is something that we want to be mindful of.
And with the current rainstorm that we had like 2 days ago, I guess that's
right
on my mind.
Yes.
So
yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Chris, do you have anything you want to say at this point?
I think Adam pretty much, covered the questions I wanted to ask. I don't think I really have anything else at this point. No, thank you.
Okay. Do you think that you are in favor of proceeding ahead with removing the master development plan language from the zoning regulations as is, and then looking at the subdivision regulations and possibly revisiting the language again in a subsequent procedure?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would do is ask, what was it, Mr. Holt, were you the one who raised the issue related to the subdivision?
Yes, he was.
Yeah. Does that sound like a good solution to you?
I have some more extensive comments on that. I would say that I would think a more sensible approach would be along the lines of what Mark had suggested, in terms of looking at this master development plan language as a whole in totality versus trying to segment out the PUDs and the subdivision regulations. That would be just my personal opinion on that. And I think versus trying to do it just in one place and then do it in another place later. I think a consideration by the commission of that whole concept, as Mark brought up, what's the harm in leaving it in the meantime? But again, my personal opinion on that.
What do you think about that, Virginia? I mean, this is the thing I guess I'm having a hard time getting a firm grasp on is whether it's going to be more useful to look at this as a whole, as we did originally. We seem to think that there was some wisdom to that approach, or whether we lose something by, and I understand how we got to, the proposed approach, but whether we lose some perspective on that by divvying up the topics. What is from your perspective, what's the real value of settling the first issue before we look at subdivision?
Making forward progress is the value, in that the master development plan has been, we've had discussions with the zoning, our planning and zoning department, the DRB. They're not finding this workable. And so I would like to respond to that. And, we have had some discussion about it. We have not had any suggestions as to how an expanded version of it would improve it, how it is going to achieve the goal of providing certainty for neighbors, which seems to be what they want. The attorney has advised us that developers develop a vested interest in a master development plan as well, and come to feel like whatever they've presented, if they've had a master development plan approved, is permissible. Times change, things change. This doesn't seem like it's a very good idea to actually set that in stone from either the neighbor's point of view or the developer's point of view. And it leads to these expectations that even an expanded version, there will be expectations that somehow this is going to improve the outcome for the neighbors, that they will understand what's going to happen on this parcel. So the experience in Richmond is that it has been, for the kinds of developments that we have here, the kinds of PUDs that we have here, it has not been useful or effective and has been difficult to work with. So my feeling is, why not do something about it? So anyway.
Yeah, well, I guess in principle, I do support removing regulations that are not demonstrably effective or beneficial. So if that is the opinion of the commission, based and it sounds like there's good support for that, I would support that generally.
Great. Any other comments? Yes, Allison.
Yeah, I just want to know, have the neighbors been specific about what it is that they don't want? You talked about, the neighbors wanting protection. Right. What is it that the neighbors want?
Well, you can ask Mr. Holt, who is here. He's currently involved as a neighbor.
Yeah. In
a case. So what do you think, Bradley? What is it that you don't want?
So
or do want? Don't want or do want? Yeah.
Sure.
Or don't want. You want?
Yeah. I would say I want to clarify that my concern is not really about so much what can be guaranteed about the future or about certainty.
Yeah.
It's more about accountability, right? So my concern is in a scenario when you have a developer who clearly plans to build a project in phases. There's evidence that the developer plans to build that project in phases. The DRB and the zoning administrator ignore that evidence. The developer then claims that there are no further development plans, and everybody looks the other way. Right? That's my concern, is that scenario, right? Where it is a phased project, but no one wants to acknowledge that it's a phased project. So I understand that, plans can change. I understand we're not asking anyone to make a plan that doesn't exist. I understand that, things could happen in the future. There's no guarantees, but I do think that there is a difference between those scenarios and a scenario where someone is purposely evading, potentially purposely evading those regulations, right? And I think that's also why, in my comments during the public hearing, I brought into the question the topic of misrepresentations, because it's within that context, right? Like, just looking at this master development plan language alone in isolation isn't, we could debate that back and forth for sure, but I think it's really that broader question of like, how do you hold someone accountable in that scenario? And it may be accountable now, or it might be accountable later. It might be making them go on the record and say things now, put things on the record now that then they have to be accountable to in the future, right? So I think that is broad strokes what I would ask this commission to consider. I don't know exactly how to implement that in a regulation, but I do think that going ahead and just removing the master development plan language, my concern with that is it sets a policy intent that this commission doesn't. It sets the tone that the commission doesn't agree that is a problem, right? And I would appreciate some acknowledgement that it is a problem, right? That's what I'm looking for here, and I don't know exactly how to do that, but that would be sort of the best way I would describe my concern there.
Thank you. Actually, you just did that. If you're saying you can't say it's you don't know how to describe it, but it just is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I feel particularly sensitive about that area of town is and I can't forget the fact that a lot of that area with some of these older houses that this was developed initially before cars. We don't have a road infrastructure in some of these areas that really takes care of the amount of traffic that there actually is, and people get really frustrated with that. So I just have a general concern for a sense of reality, and particularly with the recent storms and all that we've had. I'm just concerned about people investing lots of money and effort into properties and then having potential destruction that they can't help.
Yeah, well, each phase would have to come in for new permitting, which opens up the question of the public hearings and so forth. Whether or not you have said that you're going to do that or not, or had no idea that you were going to do it, or didn't know what you planned for the future, or whether you did have a plan for the future, you would still have to come in to amend either just to amend your approval, or to amend both your master development plan and your approval, which is like a two-step procedure rather than a one-step procedure. You would need to come in, which would open up the review process and the public hearings at the same time. So it, to me, amounts to the same thing. You still have to come back for amendments. So, Lisa, member of the select board, what do you have to say here?
Well, I'm wondering, Virginia, how the language that I've seen in some zoning regulations, not in ours, but elsewhere, speaks to the character of the neighborhood, which is probably about the most nebulous term you could ever put in writing. It's you know it when you see it. But that can be, I think that can be documented better than it's normally required to be. Photographic evidence, 4 points of the compass from three different perspectives. I think whenever the term character of the neighborhood is used, is talking about the soft parts, not the buildings, not the roads, not all the stuff that's on the plats, you know. It's the other stuff. It's the greenery. It's the rolling land. It's the view. It's, you know, all the things that make up a Norman Rockwell painting. But the character of the neighborhood is something that I think could be defined more photographically or pictorially than in writing. We're trying to do all these things in writing, and the words just aren't adequate, or we're just not, you know, I don't know, fluent enough. But I don't know if there's any precedent for that. I think Keith is probably rolling his eyes, thinking, "Oh my God, I really want a whole file cabinet full of photos." But you know, photos can be taken different times of the year. Perspective changes. Nothing else changed, but the trees did, the grass did. You know, I think that would be more of a living document that we need, particularly when we're trying to follow phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, you know, over 5 or 7 years. That original character of the neighborhood can be preserved as a reference to see if we're going off the rails slowly as development progresses. And I don't know, maybe I should stop talking at that point, but I know somewhere I've seen character of the neighborhood as a quality to be defined, and I don't think anyone can define it, but we're trying to use words. Maybe we need to step back and think about a better way to do that.
Interesting.
Yeah, and there are, you know, obviously many angles to consider the character of the neighborhood. For instance, and what we have done in our zoning regulation is define the character of the neighborhood as the character of the district. So
Right. And
if
even
the
then,
district allows residences and
Mhm.
your DRB wants to interpret the character of the neighborhood or the district as
Mhm.
being a residential district,
Mhm.
you know, that's one way to look at it.
Mhm.
Somebody else on the Conservation Commission might might define the character of the neighborhood as being so many trees and so much grass
Mhm.
and so forth. So I think it's fairly difficult. Our DRB is particularly disinclined to make those kinds of subjective decisions. They want something to be defined. So
Mhm.
I'm not sure whether that would fly. Pretty hard to define even in pictures, but
Yeah, we're at a conundrum because I mean
Right.
the words and numbers can only go so far, and we've reached the limits of them. We bump up against those limits, and we're kind of trying to grasp at something that those don't define anymore or adequately. And everybody knows that there should be more to it, but it isn't in the words and in the numbers. You know, and I'm just wondering, and again, I agree with you. I don't want to put something in, see us put something in motion that's completely indefensible and unintelligible and undefinable. That really isn't a very good law. But the,
difficult to work with.
yeah, it makes everybody look bad, you know. But
Yeah.
there's got to be something better than, I'm not saying better than what we're doing. We're making a big effort. I mean, this commission, this town does a lot of work, and I've seen it up close, and it's some good people putting a lot of effort into things. I don't want to see that wasted, but I'd like to see it, and I'd like to see it assisted with something that we maybe don't have right now. We need some assistance here in our process. So maybe I'll just leave that on the table and
Right.
see where
Okay.
we go with it.
Yep. Thank you. Chris.
I actually want to take us back to Mr. Holt's original concern, but I want to defer to Keith if he's got something that's relevant to the discussion that we've just having.
Yeah. Keith.
Yeah. The only thing I'm just saying, be cognizant of the time at this point.
Okay.
That's all.
Yep. We'll have about 15 more minutes on this discussion, and maybe after 10 we'll decide what we want to do motion wise. So, okay, Chris.
Okay. I guess if I'm understanding correctly, Mr. Holt, is what you're describing is essentially piecemeal development, right?
That's right, exactly.
Yeah, okay. And I guess my discomfort with the way that you expressed it was that it sounds like you'd be asking the town government to regulate intent and to try and predict the future a little bit, which I think tends to put small government into a particularly difficult position. And I guess I have a question for Keith, and well, for anybody really, about this is, are there other pathways that could be taken? Because I'm also very sympathetic to anything that we can do to keep developers from circumventing the intended planning process, which is what you're talking about, I think. And whether there are regulations that we could adopt that are aiming more directly at piecemeal development. Whether it be something like, I don't know, mandating wait periods before development of contiguous parcels of X size or something like that. But this is something I'm very ignorant about the history on. So Keith or anybody else, if you've got some knowledge on this, please enlighten me.
Well, I mean, my 2 cents is, and I am biased because I am a zoning administrator and your planner. I don't agree with what Bradley's saying. I don't think it's piecemeal development. And right there is part of the conundrum. We follow the regulations as written. We try not to deviate from that. I understand Bradley's concern specifically about the master development plan. There's no doubt about that. But I just disagree that it's piecemeal development at this point.
Well, what would your definition of piecemeal development be if you don't think that what he described is?
I don't have one. I don't give any thought to it in this context. I follow the regulations. If the regulations aren't followed, and for some reason something gets built, well, then we violate.
So just to add to that, I mean, I think what Keith is saying is that if you have a PUD or a subdivision, you come in for a certain number of permits. You may have some open space remaining, let's say. You come in for permits for what it is that you want to do, and the regulations are examined by the DRB or the zoning administrator for whether they abide by the regulations. And if so, the permit is given. Whether or not you say down the line, I might want to do this or that, which you may or may not know, or you may or may not reveal, doesn't matter, because if you have open space remaining, unless it is preserved, protected, have a conservation easement or some other legal mechanism to keep it open, you are allowed to develop on that piece of land. It is your piece of land and you may develop on it. You will have to come back in for more permits. You will have to have the permit process and the amendment process opened up again, and people can speak now about the new conditions. So, the term piecemeal development doesn't really have any legal standing. It's a term that people use when they want to say that this is all you can do on your land. You can't do anything further. If you do, it's piecemeal development. So,
I would add that's partially speaking for me, Virginia. I appreciate that.
Yeah, sorry to be speaking for you. But.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I understand the concept, but I deal in reality, and I'm not saying Bradley's not dealing in reality. He is. He's living it. I get that. Okay. What I'm trying to state is that we have certain parameters that we must follow, and that is the lens by which we look at these, and that's all that we can do at this point. I think what we did in this regard is we made a pretty good faith effort on strengthening whatever conditions will be imposed on any approvals by the DRB with those critical condition approvals. And that was a nod to folks in the public that had an issue with us removing the master development plan. We knew that we get some kickback on it, but we figured we'd try to strengthen it. So that was our approach to that.
Somebody else had a hand up here. Adam, did you have your hand up? No, you did not have a hand up. All right, any other commissioners want to weigh in? We're working down to, in 5 minutes, we're going to wrap up the discussion portion and find out what people want to do with this project. So, okay, another quick word from you, Bradley.
You're muted, bud.
Yep.
You're muted. Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I do have some more comments. I'll try to keep it as short as possible, and keep it really focused.
Couple of minutes. Yeah.
And I'll keep it focused on the memo and the discussion tonight, not trying to avoid rehashing anything from the previous meeting. But first want to say that I disagree that there is no legal standing for piecemeal development. Developers aren't supposed to be able to shield their contemplated plans. And I would say that although I understand the administrative challenges with the language, the master plan language. It is consistent with my understanding of the law here, right? And that if you shield your plans, you're not supposed to be able to do that. And I think there's a couple things here too to consider that I brought this idea of cumulative impact, right? That if you do a number of things as piecemeal, you might be getting more of an impact than you would if you approve than you would if you had those considered as one thing. So I do think that is an important point. And I also think that it's important to point out here that another reason why I brought up the misrepresentations issue is because it's not just about what you can do now, it's what you can set up for the future, right? So if you can make a developer go on the record, say things, make them put things out on the record, that makes it challenging for them in the future to carry piecemeal development, right? And might be enough to dissuade them from doing it in the first place, right? So I think this is a little bit more nuanced to that there. I do want to address a few other things from the memo specifically that I think were important to address. I think that if you do move forward with removing the master development plan language from the PUD language, and then go and revisit this specifically within subdivision regulations, this is presented as a foregone conclusion and simply a procedural issue. I would say if this commission is going to host a public hearing on this topic, you should not enter that public hearing with prejudice. Otherwise, what's the point of the public hearing, right? So I think that's I'd just like to ask the commission if as you move forward with the subdivision one to really come into that with an open mind and not prejudging how you want to move forward with that. I think this removal of the language from the PUD section at least has some additional protections against piecemeal development in this critical permit condition language. Again, I have concerns about that. I don't think it's quite enough, but at least there are some limited protections there. But there are no such limited protections against piecemeal development when it comes to non-PUD subdivisions. So if you remove this language from subdivision regulations, then there's no protections whatsoever. And it's pretty clear that this master development plan language within the subdivision regulations does apply to all subdivisions, not just PUDs. If you look at the DRB's decisions, its rulings, for example, in a recent ruling, they did say that the master development plan noted in section 610 of the Richmond subdivision regulations only has to be conceptual. Any further subdivision of a lot would require a new subdivision application. So the DRB themselves, even though they find this language problematic, they do acknowledge that it does apply to all subdivisions, not just PUD subdivisions, right? So I just want to make that clear. So again, I just want to make sure this commission is thinking carefully about if moving forward with this, when you do revisit this in the context of subdivisions, non-PUD subdivisions.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, and one point about the phasing is that the DRB does consider previous phases when they're looking at a new phase or a new amendment to a permit application that comes in. They are going to consider the previous phases, whatever has been done in the past, and see if it's within a certain period of time, how that is adding up. Let's see, Adam.
Yeah, I guess I just I fully understand Bradley's concerns. I agree with most of them, actually. I just wanted to push back on one point, is that there's no constraints against piecemeal development. I think fundamentally that's wrong. I lived in a town where there was 0 constraints against piecemeal development on the town level, which means that there are no regulations outside of state wastewater regulations in Act 250. And that's a fundamentally different position than we sit in Richmond. So I think that it's easy to view piecemeal from the lens of, a developer is carrying out piecemeal development. But I think fundamentally, piecemeal development is I guess I haven't been able to find a legal term that's defining it, but it's it'd be a series of small changes, whatever, taken out, probably not carried out with a cohesive plan. And fundamentally, I mean, that's the purpose our town plan and our zoning regulations serve. So there are strong regulations and constraints on piecemeal development, which are, have input from everyone in town who wants to participate. And I think the regulations, if the regulations are strong enough and carry, provide the constraints we want in line with our town plan, then we wouldn't need further constraints. I guess I still see them as a crutch for having strong regulations that really carry out and show the purpose of what we actually want to accomplish.
Okay, great, thanks. So are there any last minute comments by anyone, especially anyone who hasn't spoken, would like to talk about this? Okay, so not hearing anything, I would like to ask the commission, what is your will here? What would you like to do? Here are the options. We can make a motion to move these documents to the select board as is, which is the red line copy, the clean copy, and the bylaw amendment that removes the master development plan language from the zoning regulations and adds the critical permit language. That would be one motion that we could make. We could table the discussion and continue this discussion at a subsequent hearing. I think if we want to make changes to the documents, we're going to have to table it anyway. We're going to have another discussion session where we look at some new documents if somebody wants to suggest that we want to have some new documents. So you could suggest, if you wished, that we warn the whole thing again as a package with this IC language, that we move this IC residential use language along without altering at all anything about the master development plan, or a suggestion that we put it all together and rewarn the whole thing. So anybody have any desires to stick your neck out and make a recommendation here?
Well, okay, go ahead, Allison.
Allison, yeah, then Mark.
I was just going to say, why not just warn it, put it out there and see how people feel about it.
You mean, wait, so you're suggesting that we send it to the select board for their public hearing process, what we have already, or that we rewarn some new documents that we would have to work up that have changes in them or that involve the subdivision regulations? Which one of those are you suggesting?
I don't know. I think
Okay.
I'm suggesting that we warn something and make a start.
Well, we have already done that because we warned our public hearing and we had our public hearing, and this is what now we are deciding whether the documents that we refined based on our public hearing and our attorney input, whether those documents, we should approve them to be sent to the select board for their public hearing process. So that would be that. If we're moving it to the next step, we've already had the public hearing. We're in the discussion phase. We can take as long as we want. we would like to get the IC part done. So anyway, you can think about that for a moment and decide what you would like to really suggest, and we'll go to Mark.
Yeah, Mark.
I would propose that we go forward with the IC district language and the PUD language, which drops specific reference to the master development plan, but adds the critical conditions component to it,
Mhm.
cleans that up a bit, a little bit more reinforceable. There is still the subdivision plan, which is out there, and I would proffer that we stew on that a little bit, investigate it, try to come up with additional language similar to this critical conditions plan. I don't know if there's folks out there who might have specific language or insight that would strengthen what the intent of our master development plan was intended to be, but fails horribly at. But this would allow us to get the IC district clean, which a big part of that is the incorporation in the PUD. And get those two components moving and through the system and up to the select board in time for spring building. To be finalized and the waiting periods and all that to go through before anything can actually be done. And then there's going to be, of course, DRB hearings on that as well. And so it's going to be a process. And the longer we wait to sit on it and to rework it, the bigger the delay it's going to be. You're looking at end of January, beginning of February before we move it to the select board, and then the select board's got to warn it, and then and then they've got that, was it 30-60 day waiting period afterwards before it becomes enacted. You're really pushing it well into spring before making any plans, and then going through the DRB process. You're really looking at a huge, a considerable timeline. So I really like the critical conditions, and that kind of language, I think, is the essence of what we wanted to do with the master development plan. So I would go forward with those two sections and leave the subdivision section to build further on. Thank you.
Well, so the current documents would need to be revised if we didn't change, if we don't want to change the master development plan language. The current documents, I don't think we should approve those for transmittal. Do you want to go ahead?
My point was to take the red line versions as you've laid them out and move those forward, not rework them, not do anything to them, clean version, move that forward to the select board. But we're in a delayed pattern for the preliminary subdivision discussion anyways. That wasn't warned properly. I think we've all come to a consensus on, and so that's not going anywhere fast anyways. So let's move through the part that we want to accomplish in a timely manner and spend some time talking about it. Maybe we'll get together at the next meeting after we've moved this forward and say, okay, all we're going to do is, fix the red line, warn the hearing, which is going to be another, month or so before that even comes to a hearing level.
So this version, just to make sure that you're on the same page, this version that you have in front of you removes the master development plan language from the zoning in PUDs from the zoning ordinance. So yes. You're good with that. So that's what it adds the critical permit language, but it also removes the master development plan language from the subdivision. It doesn't do anything from, not the subdivision requirements, only from the zoning regulation does it remove it.
Only from the PUD regulations.
Only from the PUD, which is in the zoning regulation.
Oh, yes, but it doesn't affect the subdivision link at this point.
It does not affect the subdivision language, which says that for any subdivision, a master development plan is required.
That's what I'm saying. I
Okay,
think that
so,
would accomplish the short-term goals and help us build on some long-term goals.
okay. Just a couple more minutes on this, then we really have to move on. Adam,
Yeah.
I was just gonna echo what Mark was saying and make a motion that we take, I think it's item E off the agenda. Would be the residential uses as part of a PUD in the additional commercial district and the PUD revisions. And we move that to the select board. And then at the same time, we table the proposed revision of subdivision regulations and possibly warn for a future hearing at a later date. And so that would be.
so Keith can give you a motion that you could
Okay.
state.
Go
He
ahead,
can put it up there. I take it if both you and if Adam and Mark are both on this page, we'll have a motion and a second. So what's the motion, Keith?
What I've mocked up is, I state your name. Present a motion to move forward the zoning amendments as presented at the December 20th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting. Or something to that effect, because we're
Okay,
not
and-
changing anything that's been presented.
Okay, just to clarify, that motion would allow us the leeway to not move forward with the subdivision amendments,
Correct.
right? Only, okay. So what was it? Adam
And
Wood?
he could add that in too, right, Keith? He could say, and we're going to table this, any references to the subdivision regulations for a future date.
For clarity, that's fine, sure.
Sure, yeah. So I, Adam Wood, make a motion that we move forward with the amendments as stated at the, what was it? December
20th.
December 20th meeting. We table any references to the subdivision regulations.
Okay, is there a second? Mark is, I think, raising his hand, or were you just waving?
I was completely speaking to somebody off screen. I apologize.
Okay, are you
I'm now
second?
raising my hand and seconding that motion.
Okay, so seconded by Mark. Okay, any further discussion on this motion? So this involves a red line copy of the revision to the zoning regulations, a clean copy, and the bylaw amendment report as required. So those three things are in your packet. All right. If there's no further discussion, I'll call your name and you can vote your vote on this. Adam,
Aye.
Mark, Allison,
Aye.
Chris,
Aye.
and I will vote aye on this
Mhm.
as well. So we will send these documents as written to the select board for their hearing process. And then we will come back soon and look at the subdivision requirements. So thank you all. That's great. And we're going to move quickly on to our next topic, which is also important.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm sorry.
So, item number 6, discuss information from Buttermilk relative to the Creamery from their submission from November 15th and December 5th and all previous, but we're not going to go to all previous, regarding increasing density at the Creamery. So, and luckily we have Josie here, we have Brendan here, hi, and we have some other people maybe who are here to talk about this.
Yeah, I'm going.
So just a very quick, do a little introduction here and then Josie can talk about why they are looking for increased density. Actually, maybe Josie, why don't you do that first? Tell us why you're looking for more density at the Creamery and how it relates to the fact that we don't have enough housing and we have a housing crisis.
Thank you. You actually read my mind. Because actually I was gonna, after Keith and I had several conversations over the last couple of weeks around this, I thought it was important to kind of take a step back, because I know the last conversation we had, the number of residential units scared everyone, which I can understand. That's a big number compared to where the 125 asked. So I thought it would be actually pretty useful to set the scene for where that number came from and why we're talking about it. And some of this is going to be a repeat. Keith, are you still there? Do you want me to share the slides, or are you going to share the thing that I sent this afternoon? I just saw him. Oh, maybe I can send it. Never mind. You've given me access. So
Okay.
I'll just drive if that's okay. I'm well versed in Zoom. So what I wanted to do is start first because, and I know many of you have this history, so I apologize if there's a little bit of a history lesson on this, but I kind of wanted to remind people and to kind of create for the public record a clear understanding of where the residential, I am identifying just the maximum residential units allowable on this property in this district alone. I'm not talking about all the other statutes and regulations, just that one. So before 2014, before interim zoning, there was 0 residential units allowed. The property had sat abandoned, and it was a brown field that ended up costing about $1.5 million to clean up. And smartly, the town identified that they needed interim zoning to be indicated to make it viable, because they had for 20 years, it had been set undevelopable because the owner at that stage could not afford the cleanup cost and the redevelopment. And there was all this other regulations. I won't get into that. And so they came up with interim zoning. Interim zoning was desired to keep the commercial element, but to increase the viability and bringing housing and residential. And when we got on board, it worked. Brendan got interested. He had looked at it many times in the past and said, this is not a viable project. Now that you've done your interim zoning, now we can look at it. Then we spent 9 months looking at, okay, is this a viable project? Can we make it? And we said, hey, at 15 units with a density bonus for senior, this doesn't work for us. We cannot cash flow it. And so it was in 2015, before we purchased it, before we took on the $1.5 million of brownfield cleanup, it was changed from that zone, from that 15 and 24 up to 45 units. Then that 45 units has been the cap until current today. In 2019, just to recap, and FYI, some of the documents that we presented in the last time identified this stuff, but we didn't talk about it. So I just thought I would be useful in sharing that. I mean, I remember having conversations with many of you in 2019 when we started talking about how do we actually incorporate Jelena Court into regular zoning, because the interim zoning had expired. And so and during those conversations, we all talked about increasing the density. So, but in the end, after 18 to 20 months of discussions, both with the Planning Commission and the Select Board, we actually moved forward with the existing density at 45 units. So that I just wanted to give that background so that we really understand. Even to that day when we presented that, that was agreed. FYI, that was in April of 2020 when we had just launched the building and the world was turning upside down. We warned that was not going to be a viable opportunity with the amount of commercial burden, but we didn't know where the world would be. That is nearly 4 years ago. So where did the 125 come from? So I think this answer is actually going to surprise many of you. And actually the answer is the 125 is based on a request that came from, and now Keith has been very clear about this, is he's not sure how much Revi in 2021 and 2022, and I were having tons of conversations because you had done the housing study and you formed the housing committee, subcommittee. And part of that is in about, I think it was March or February of 2022, he requested an email, which I've shared that email with Keith, and it said, if we wanted 15 to 20 affordable units at 80% AMI, what would you need to achieve that? So we did an extensive analysis of the cash flow of looking at if we are going to fund the shortfall, right, of that market rate of that lower income driving unit, what would we need to replace as income across the board? And how many more units would we need to offset those costs? And we did a huge analysis looking at, okay, what is being currently marketed? What is useful? What is the cash flow? What is the cost of construction? What are the rental costs? All of that stuff. And that is when we got to the the proposal that I hope you guys have seen from 2022, which was if you want 15 units, we would need density of 85 to offset those costs. And if you need 20, we need an offset. So that was the foundation by which, when we restarted after how many months we hadn't heard back, Revi had left, Keith had started, and part of that discussion was, okay, what would you need today? And so I was not interested in rerunning that very time-consuming pro forma, seeing that we didn't even had made no headway in prior attempts. So we just said, hey, cost of construction is 30% more. So what we would need is 30% more units. So the reason I put that out is I don't know if 125 is the right number for Richmond. All I know is if what we were asked back in last year is if we were ready to commit and we could commit to offering a certain amount of affordable across the development, what would we need to achieve that? And that's where we got to the number. So I guess my question is like when we're coming to this, and then I'm going to go into this next slide to say, what does Richmond want? Because frankly, I listened to the select board meetings at the live one on Monday and several of the past meetings and read a lot of the notes. And I'm genuinely would love some guidance on we have information from the housing survey, we have information from the town plan, but what are we actually looking for in terms of both type of housing, right? There's a lot about talking about affordable Section 8. That's a certain type of product, right? But then there's housing that's affordable, right? And then there's workforce housing. I don't know if that's different than housing that is affordable. In my mind, they sit close together. And then, or is it at market? Back in, for clarity's sake, and I have notes on this, in 2015, it was very clearly explained to me and in later years that we want at market, only at market. And it was just very interesting how that communication has changed. So I guess my question today is one of my questions for us all is what type of housing? And then what's the volume? Right? Because I think that is key. And I think one of the things that came very clear from the select board meeting on Monday was, and I would fully agree, I can't remember which one of the select board members very adequately and very clearly said that, we need to think long-term about our housing needs. It took us 8 years to get 14 units up and running. And what do we need 5 years from now? What do we need 10 years from now? What do we need 20 years from now? Because one of the things that is very clear is that the size of housing and how houses are existing in today's world is very different than the past. You need more houses, more units to suffice the same population because there's more people living alone, there's more divorcees, et cetera, et cetera. So just as a thought, I wanted to share that. So the why we are here, I think just to recap Virginia, and I wanted to go on from now. I know I see Chris has got his hands up, But I kind of wanted to kind of just state for the record where all this came from and why are we talking about these numbers? Like, we've been committed to supporting housing efforts in Vermont across the board. In the presentation that we made in 2015, which I know several of you were involved in that conversation, we identified that putting a reduction on units actually incentivizes bigger and luxury units. We fought hard for a volume mix so that we could offer smaller units, right? So that we could offer workforce housing, affordable housing, and housing across the spectrum. And I think that, frankly, we've been very successful at that. I don't know if you saw that what I sent around was a snapshot of who's living at the Creamery. And I can review that if that's helpful. I don't know if that would be helpful, but I think to be honest, what I'd never looked at that data until last week. And I'd always kind of noticed, because I look at a lot of the residential applications, and it is a very good mix of types of people, ages, people who are working from home, people who are teachers, people who are working for nonprofits, young families, single mothers. Lots of people have moved from other markets. So people have moved from New York City. With people, there's a brand new graduate, is one of our smallest studios. He just moved here and he's an engineer from New York City. There's nurses who have traveled and come from California, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know, unless Keith or Virginia think that it would be useful to go through this, but one of the things that we tried to set out to do, actually, frankly, we've delivered on it. And I was pretty reassured by this information. So it does fit very much to why are we here and what are we asking for? And I don't know what that number is, because all I know is that there is a cost number that is not debatable, right? And so I think that it is something that we'll continue to have a discussion about. But and then Keith, do you want to put up the last thing that I shared? Just so that, and I figured I'd go through this, and I'm not sure if people have reviewed all this, which is the other document. Thank you.
Oh,
Oh,
that one we've seen. Yeah.
that one you've seen. It was the timeline-y thingy.
Josie, could you
Yeah.
just briefly
Sure.
say the other point that you've made in a couple of
Yes.
these documents, which is
Yes.
your short-term goal?
Okay,
And the
sure.
fact that, it ties in with this discussion we've
Totally.
been having about master planning, which is that you don't know what the future will bring. You would like to look at what building 1 and building 2 do to the situation before going forward. So you also presented a goal that is more limited than looking at 15 years, which who knows what the future will bring. So if you could just
Totally.
briefly present
Yep.
that as also a goal that you've stated.
Yes. No, I think that's great. So from the beginning, I mean, it was within I know for us to get the financing for the housing survey, when we got the grant for that, we submitted a letter and said, part of the problem is that we can't proceed forward with a construction financing based on the current program, that we would need the lenders, and it's 10 times worse now, changes to zoning or a significant change in the market conditions for us to proceed with building 2. Building 2, we've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in engineering and really hoped to get it off the ground. For 8 years, we've been marketing it for commercial space. In those 8 years, we've only had one tenant that is interested, and that tenant was going to be paying way below what we could afford to fund it. There is just, we would lose money on every single square footage of commercial space. And that's just a well-known reality of commercial space. So our goal right now, our short-term goal, is to really get, and we've communicated this We believe in slow growth. We believe in adding units, testing the market, understanding, and adding and seeing what we need. So, our first growth is to really get building 2 across the finish line, and so that we can be offering housing and some smaller commercial space for the community and offer that vibrancy. And so I did this after that last conversation because this was FYI, this was included in one of the proposals back in 1942 when we first talked about it. We've never said tomorrow we're going to flood the market. It would be against our best interest. So this was really about, okay, how do we actually see these units? And again, finger in the air, as Virginia said, on building 3 and 4. I have directional view based on what's happened in 1 and what I suspect is going to happen in 2, but 3 and 4 don't know. Building 2, what I think is our best guess is that we would need up to 55, we could fit up to 55 units into the building. And we would still retain about 2,000 to 3,000 square footage of commercial. And that commercial would be meaningful, relevant commercial, not in almost an entire floor. Like, for example, we know that there's a huge opportunity of offering a gym. We're committed to that. We think it's an excellent opportunity. We have smaller office space that people have been interested in, and little smaller offices, not big scale office buildings. And then another concept that has always been playing, which I know Gabe has always been talking about, is a smaller cafe or thing. Now, all of that would have to be fully spec'd. But then the total number of units that I would expect us to use, and I don't know if I would have to relook at all of it, would be 55 units. So that would be in building 2, and then building 3 and 4 would be who knows. Now, sorry, go on.
For right now, I just wanted to focus on what you're needing for building 2.
Hi,
So
Virginia, can I jump in?
going.
I wanted to
Sure.
try.
Can we focus on building 2? What do we need?
Yeah,
Parking,
exactly.
commercial,
Yeah.
number of units. What
Yeah.
is it? Zoning changes. What do you need for building number 2?
Yeah.
Granted that you're feeling that the future is not, you don't know about the future with
Correct.
building 3 and 4. So go ahead, Brendan, and then Chris.
Yeah. And I just wanted to be really brief. Yes, in short of everything, the goal was a number of units that we can't spec, which is what we're talking about. And it was the hope of 123, 125 or something. But in the short term, building 2 to try and make it feasible so we could build it, adding units to it, period. And the number of units we wanted to add to it was to get to a goal of about 55 or about 20, 25 more units that are approved right now for it. That's purely it. If we can get there somehow and eliminate or limit the amount of commercial square footage, because in summary, commercial square footage and commercial rents, no matter what they do, if they're high or low, don't compare to residential rents. And because of the high mortgage rate and the high construction costs, won't pay the mortgage. So in order for building 2 to succeed, we just need to limit the amount of commercial footage. And the only thing that would motivate and motivates us as the builder developer would be some commercial units that are vibrant related for the development, like a cafe that Josie mentioned, like a gym, things that bring more residents in and they'll live to work and work from home and stay more within the community instead of being a bedroom community. That helps the development. So that being said, 55 units, plus or minus. There's different ways to skin the commercial needs about how we limit it, which we can talk about. So that's it.
Great. Okay. That was nice and concise. Chris, I'm going to call on Chris because he's had his hand up forever.
Thanks, Virginia. And my questions have to do with the information about affordable units. And Josie, you mentioned 80% AMI, and I guess it came up twice. One in the document, Who Lives at the Creamery, which, by the way, thank you. That's really useful to have that information. But you say that several are below 80% AMI. Is there any income screening of tenants that happens at this point for those units?
Yes, well, there's a part of an application process to make sure that they can afford a unit, right? So they have
Well,
to
that's
there.
the credit check, yeah,
But we are
whatever.
not we are not Cathedral Square. We can't monitor that. We can't track that. But it has lived up to, we have committed to trying to support people who are lower income and workforce housing. And frankly, some of the units are appealing to those individuals because they're around $1,000, right? And that is affordable 60%, 80% AMI.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
so
see what you're saying,
that's what I want to
that's-
make
okay.
clear, that they're talking about units that are affordable with no paperwork, no Section 8. We're not talking about them being a housing authority that
We can't be.
does technical affordable housing, but
So,
making them small enough and making the rent cheap enough. So
right, but what's embedded here is an assumption about rent as a percentage of income and so forth and so on. That okay, so that do you know what that is? That rent as a percentage of income that would make somebody with 80% AMI would make one of these units affordable.
So we follow the Vermont Housing Finance Association guidance around that. And I think Virginia circulated in her documents. It's been well circulated. It's the table that's put out, and each of that shows what is the unit size, what is the pay. I can share that if you have not looked at it, but that's, I mean, frankly, that's what we've been reviewing for several years in all of these discussions about affordability.
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
that link is in your memo, Chris, that takes you to the table that talks about AMI. And, you know, we want to be absolutely clear that that's what we're talking about here.
Okay. And then the other question related to this that I had was on when you were looking at and I've now misplaced my copy of that document, but it's the one about the numbers. I guess that Keith had that up actually earlier. When talking about the number of affordable units and how many market units you would need in order to be able to, then I assume from what you've said that that's because you're not Cathedral Square, that you're not taking into account things like tax credits or other kinds of incentives that are available for the developers of affordable housing.
We worked with last year, we met with Vermont, with Revy, had a long conversation with Vermont Agency of Housing Financing. And I had previous conversations, but we wanted to kind of net it out. And none of those programs actually work for us, work for an organization and a project and a scope and a community such as Richmond, right? Like none of those projects, those tax incentives, those credits, Richmond isn't big enough. It is not connected in terms of transportation. It doesn't have the volume, all of those things to trigger some of them. And we're also now building on the scale that's thing. And so all of those conversations, like we tried to like say, hey, is there a way that we could offset these costs to give Richmond more? We were open to having that conversation. And they came back and said, frankly, none of that works for you. None of the programs that are out there federally or statewide work for a scope and project such as yours. That the best way is to manage density and to increase density so that, and other communities have done this. This is not new news to anyone here, to increase density so that there's a financial opportunity for us to cover those costs. That came about and had the conversation that we just had around affordable to at market.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the programs or approaches that were previously used successfully in Richmond to develop affordable housing are not available to you or no longer
because
available?
we're not a Cathedral Square and we're not building at it. We're not a nonprofit, right? I mean, frankly, we are, because for 8 years we've been acting like a nonprofit. I'm just being honest and funding a brownfield that, but the reality is that we are not a 501c3. We do not have the You know, I think even like was talked about at the select board meeting, that the way that they run Cathedral Square is able to offset that is that they get all of this funding from federal governments. We're not a nonprofit. We are a small developer in a building that took on a highly risky project. And frankly, the other projects, they said you needed to have hundreds of units, and then it would trigger a certain types of things. Those programs could have changed
Can
in
I
a
ask
year.
a question to Chris? I
Yeah.
just curious and trying to keep it brief. We got to be briefer because we're going to run out of time. Hey, Chris, is there anything that's applicable in terms of funding that you know that might work for us that we haven't heard about? Because we're open to it, but the
No,
stuff
this
we've
is-
met, we've hit some dead ends on, and
You
and
know, this is why I'm asking. It's not my area of expertise. Yeah.
No, I know. I'm just saying it's amazing the matrix and the labyrinth of avenues that you can find funding at, and some people have been more successful, and like nobody had approached the Creamery to get the grant, right? And suddenly we saw that, and it was just an avenue, and that we were able to execute it. But if anybody knows of it, you know, we're all ears. But that's all. Quickly.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a short amount of time left. This seemed to Keith and myself to be an important discussion to be having because we need housing. And here we have a developer who is going to provide some more housing. So we need to talk about it and be open to their concept. What we're looking for tonight is a commitment from the Planning Commission that we are interested and we would like to consider offering more density, maybe just for the short term, looking, you know, not looking at the long term, leaving that to future planning commissions, because if we only give them a short term density increase, when they come back for 3 and 4, it will be a new planning commission. It will be a new period of time. We will have seen what 1 and 2 buildings have, the impact that they have had on Richmond. They are going to have to go through this process again, but that may be all we want to offer. We want to think about it, but we want commitment that we will seriously consider increasing density, reducing the commercial space, reducing the parking, which Act 47 is going to reduce for us anyway, and also reducing commercial space will reduce the parking. Enough for building 2, perhaps only going as far as building 2, for which, and those are things that the zoning change will be required. If we wish to have any impact on building number 2, we have to do this now, virtually. We have to have a short timeline, and the Neighborhood Development Association or area, the NDA process could be begun if we feel that it could be a nice neighborhood, that we can negotiate about that. But for them to think about building 2, it will need to happen soon. We will need to have this on our agenda, and maybe tonight we can come to some kind of, you know, general commitment from the Planning Commission that we are willing to entertain this density. As you know, it's been a big issue at the moment in Richmond, having more housing. So,
but Virginia, just to clarify, this is conceptually and separate from any specific number, correct?
A commitment is to seriously consider increasing their density allowance, at least for building number 2, not committing to any number.
Okay.
But we got to start somewhere, and we don't have enough time right now to talk about some number proposals, which are in the memo, but they're just things for people to think about. If you could think about the things that are on that list, there are ways of thinking about those numbers. But I think that they're not going to be willing to further work on this unless they feel that there's a serious consideration being given to increasing the density.
So Virginia, I am going to note the lateness of the hour and the seriousness of the question that you're raising.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's really feasible to ask people to get through this in the next 5 minutes, which is all I have tonight.
Yeah.
If-
Yeah, well, that is something that we can take up at our next meeting. We're going to have this as a standing item on our agenda, because if we want to do anything, it's going to have to be in the next few months, so 6 months.
Okay.
So, you know, we're going to have to move along forward. We're not going to be able to endlessly consider it if we would like to, you know, help provide some additional housing. So anyway, but I'm fine with taking it up, you know, next time, Chris. I don't want people to feel like they're rushed into making this decision. Let's take a couple of comments. Katie?
Well, it sounds like you're not really prepared. We're right at the end of the meeting. I can save it and come back another time, because I prepared some remarks that will take about 4 minutes to read. And it doesn't sound like you're really talking about 125 units, which is what's in the memo, but something more like 70 units. So I think, yeah, I can save my remarks to another time, to when you're actually ready to talk about an action item.
Yeah, if you're willing to come to another meeting, that would be great, because at some point we will be talking about a specific number, and
Yeah.
we will have to have this discussion about how far we want to take it. So
I do just think we need to be very careful about density in that area for a variety of reasons. Traffic, the river, which we just felt again this week, and the character of the town. But I can speak more to that later.
okay. And iPhone, somebody's iPhone. Who are you on your iPhone? Whose hand is raised?
Hi, Virginia. It's Gabriel. Sorry, I didn't realize it was my
Okay.
iPhone and not me.
Gabe.
Hi. Hey, guys.
Gabe
Hey,
Furman.
everybody. Hey,
Okay.
it's Gabriel Furman. I own Hatchet and the Big Spruce. And yeah, this topic is near and dear to me. Yeah, I'll be quick. I understand we're out of time. It's obviously a really important topic in a moment when, yeah, all the points, everything that I feel and think has been voiced here. We are in a housing crisis. I have 40 employees, most of which want to live in this community and are unable to for the lack of housing that exists within it. It's critical, you know, every day. I mean, I feel personally existing in this town, I know it well. I know it, you know, and we are late to this discussion, you know, like this is something that we're 10 years behind right now, in my opinion. And the lack of movement is reaching these, it's just becoming so untenable, you know, to find staff that want to be a part of this community, but it's so hard to witness people that want to be a part of this community and employ people that serve this community with, you know, with great care, and they can't live here and they can't afford to live here. And it's so sad. It feels like the lack of variety in demography is something that is really limiting us in our ability to create all the tenets of the town plan. And it's not just, you know, middle to high income people that should be able to live here. I just can't emphasize enough how disheartening it is. And time is of the essence. You know, I've been through many different rounds with many different boards, and you know, I've seen these processes drag on, and they're very expensive to drag on. I think what you were saying about the desire to move through something quickly is absolutely important. There's a lot of things that factor into this. We're just talking about being able to create housing for some of the marginalized people that want to be here, the young, the old, you know, many people. I could just go on. It's just, I really hope that the people that make decisions that allow for the accommodations for people that are actually going to be putting up the money to make these changes and to usher in the town plan, I hope that the people on these boards really understand the gravity of these situations. Like we need change. We need to usher it in. It's changing all around us. You can do it. We've seen it. You can maintain the characters of these towns. You can work within FEMA floodplains. The property that we're talking about was not affected. It sits outside of FEMA floodplains. It's like the same old tired arguments that keep progress from occurring are just so tiresome to me. We've seen our population is dwindling, is shrinking, and it's going to continue to shrink because there's nowhere to live here. And you have such an amazing opportunity to work with people that understand growth and understand smart growth and understand characters of communities and understand how to build within these realms. You have a very willing participant to usher in the town plan. And it's never going to be the town that ushers in the town plan. It's always going to be people that usher in the town plan. So just giving these people space to at least start to try to move the needle on the things that are so necessary for these communities to thrive and grow.
Okay, thanks, Gabe.
Yeah,
That's great. Thank you.
Totally.
I'm
Thank
gonna
you guys.
cut-
Thanks
cut
everyone.
you off. Yes, we'll
Yeah,
be
thank you.
revisiting this topic again.
Awesome. I'm so excited to
Um,
hear this topic come up. Thank you.
Yes. So what I would like to say before we close briefly is we will be talking about this at our next meeting. Please read the documents, the proposals, look at the Buttermilk file. Think about the numbers. What do we need? What information are we going to need to make us comfortable moving ahead with these decisions? That's the important thing. Are we going to need a drawing of the footprint of the building so we can see where the commercial would fit in? Or are we going to need a sketch of the parking area with the reduced numbers of parking? What is it that we're going to need to enable us to make this decision? I also would like people to think about the fact that there's been a lot of discussion about Brown's Court lately, and that is a project for which there's a ton of opposition. So
First I heard of
maybe
it.
this is a better place. Maybe this is a much better place. We have a willing developer. We have a place that is not a precious little green space. Let's think about that, try to put that in context, and try to figure out what we are going to need to be able to move this forward. So, last minute, Keith, anybody?
I'm fine. I think this went very well.
Okay.
I believe our next meeting is on January 3rd,
January 3rd. Yep.
and I will not be able to attend.
Okay, but you can read the documents anyway, because
Of
it's going to
course.
be on our second January meeting as well, until we come to some kind of resolution about this. It seems important, and so I would like everybody to really try to figure out what you need to be able to come to this decision.
No,
So,
I think it's very important, but we are out of time,
yes, we are.
and I would like to move that we adjourn.
Yes. Do we have a second?
Second.
Who was that?
I second it, Mark.
Oh, Mark seconded. Right. All right. And unless there's any last minute quick
Yeah, can I
comments.
just summarize real quickly, Virginia, to help in the
Okay,
next meeting?
yep.
with the,
1 minute. Yes.
no, 30 seconds. Metrics, you want us to bring
What the
together,
fuck?
some metrics for you that would show the number of units, what's needed, and how it's going to work.
Okay. Yep. And Keith and I can talk to people, commissioners. If you send your thoughts, what's needed to Keith, we can get it over to Brendan and Josie, and they can help us with it. So, all right. So, is there anyone who objects to us adjourning this meeting? Since there are no objections.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Happy
Great.
holidays.
Thanks for everyone for coming. Have a great midwinter holiday, and see you in January. Thank you all.